Hello, folks. Welcome back. Here we are with our next recorded lecture. We're still talking about Hick and the problem of evil. Basically, if God is all good, all knowing, and all good, all knowing, and all powerful, then why does evil exist? Now, we looked at a few different answers, right? In particular, we're going to be looking at Hick's defense or the theodicy, sometimes called the defense or vindication of God. And it's going to be focusing on free will. So, with that said, let's go ahead and pick back up with this. So the question, according to Hick, is why has an omnipotent, omniscient, and infinitely good and loving creator permitted sin in his universe? And again, sin is a very specific thing, according to him. It means to have an improper relationship with God. Keep that in mind. The traditional answer, according to him, is the free will defense. Let's review the defense in 3 steps, and he's going to sort of build on it. Step number 1, establish what omnipotence means. Remember, we talked about omnipotence a while ago, and we talk about how the infinitely heavy rock posed a problem for the idea of omnipotence for a god. Can God create something that's infinitely heavy, for instance? Or can God create something that's logically contradictory? Hick says, God's all power does not mean that he can do anything, if anything is held to include self-contradictions, such as making a round square or a horse that has none of the characteristics of a horse, or so on and so on and so on. Basically, omnipotence does not cover logical contradictions. Omnipotence does not mean that you can do what is logically impossible. So therefore, God is not beyond logic. There's an objection here. Doesn't this set a limitation on God? Doesn't this make logic, therefore, stronger than God? And he has a response to this, a response that's similar to that of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is a very famous theologian during the Middle Ages. And he says, as Aquinas comments, it is more appropriate to say that such a thing just cannot be done than that God cannot do them. It does not involve any limitation upon God's power, such that if he had more power, he would be able to accomplish these logical absurdities. So if God was even more powerful, these logical absurdities would still be out of their reach because they just can't be done at all. Now, it's not that they can't be done by anyone, or it's not that they can't be done by God, it's just they can't be done at all. So therefore, this is not a limitation on God's power, according to Hick and Aquinas. I'm not really sure about that response. What do you think? Yeah, go ahead and let me know. Here's step 2. Establish that moral free will is a necessary condition for personality. Or personality is the fancy way of saying personhood, what it means to be a person. That is, creating a being which is 1, a person, and 2, cannot freely choose to do evil or good is a logical contradiction. Because by definition, a person is someone that can do evil and good freely. So if 1 is true, then 2 must be false. And if 2 is true, 1 must be false. Creating a being, a person, with both 1 and 2 being true, therefore is a logical contradiction. And because omnipotence or logical contradiction does not fall under the purview of God's omnipotence, creating a being with 1 and 2 being true does not fall within the scope of God's divine omnipotence. Angels or other beings might not feel temptation and be able to sin. They might always be forced to do good, but angels are not persons, and we are. Remember that sin here is being understood as having an improper relationship with God. This is going to be important later. I keep stressing that. So if man is to be a being capable of entering into personal relationship with his maker, sinning or not sinning, and not a mere puppet, he must be endowed with the uncontrollable gift of freedom to be able to sin and be in an improper relationship with God, or not sin and be in a proper relationship with God. Hick believes that step 1 and step 2 in this free will defense are pretty uncontroversial, so he's going to focus mostly on step 3. Step 3 of the traditional free will defense is usually the conclusion. So step 1, God's omnipotence does not mean he can do the logically impossible. Step 2, creating persons that do not have the ability to sin is logically impossible. Conclusion, step 3, the answer to the question, why has God allowed people to sin, is essentially because there was no other choice. God had to, otherwise he would be doing something logically impossible, and that does not fall under the purview of his omnipotence. But Hick wants to push this. Is step 3 true? Does it follow from step 1 and 2? In particular, he asks us to replace it with the question, why didn't God make us all saints? So look, he says, humans, they vary in their inclination and their amount of temptation to sin. The saint at one end of the scale, of whom we can say that, they logically can sin, but it's morally impossible for them to sin because they never actually do. And the depraved and perverted human monster on the other extreme, of whom we say that it's logically possible for them to not sin and do the right thing, but it's morally impossible to not sin because they always sort of do. They're both people, and they both can logically choose to sin. So the question is, if the saint is a person and the saint never sins, even though it's logically possible for them to sin, they have the freedom to sin, but they never do because they always overcome temptation, then why didn't God just make us all saints? God could, if he wished, Hick says, produce perfect persons who, while free to sin and even perhaps tempted to sin, remain forever sinless. That is, we would overcome sin every single time because God made us in such a way that we would all be saints and always psychologically overcome the temptation. Why couldn't God make us psychologically stronger? Here's more criticism. Step 3 from Antony Flew, an English philosopher. According to Flew, a free action means that it's not externally compelled. So he considers, it's very traditional, what he considers very heteronormative. But he says, look, consider a young man's choice of the girl whom he wishes to marry. This decision is not free of his psychological makeup. He's going to choose the spouse and the partner that is attractive to him, psychologically attractive to him, both physically and maybe psychologically and emotionally and intellectually. But history leading up to this bit is free in the sense that it is his choice because it is not forced by external factors. So again, he is not free of his psychology. He is not free of his experiences in history, but those are all things that are inside him. There are not external factors. There's no gun to his head forcing him to choose a certain person to marry. Thus, according to Antony Flew, God could have created us in such a way that our psychological makeup would always choose the morally correct action. But no, in this situation, our psychological makeup still comes from us, right? It is not an external force. So if our insides were made in such a way that we always chose the right partner or the right person or the whatever you want, or the right action, whatever, that action would still be free because that action is not externally compelled. Those desires are coming from within us. Thus, God could have created free beings that never sinned, that just had very good psychological makeup. An initial response to Flew comes from Ninian Smart, a Scottish professor of religious studies. So Ninian Smart is going to try to defend this idea of God, or defend God from these criticisms. He says, look, the concept of goodness is applied to beings of a certain sort, beings who are liable to temptation, possess inclinations, have fears, tend to assert themselves, and so forth. And if they were immunized from evil, they would have to be built in a different way. But it soon becomes apparent that to rebuild them will mean that the ascription of goodness will become kind of nonsense. In other words, goodness, to be a good human, requires temptation. Persons can't be good, that is, have the right relationship with God, if they do not have temptation. An analogy is, you cannot be brave without feeling fear. So the question is, God is omnibenevolent, all good. What does this mean? Or a question here is, God is omnibenevolent, all good. What does this mean? If God is never tempted to do bad, can they truly be good? Again, there's a question we asked during the Peterson lecture. So this is a promising response, right? Basically saying that if we didn't feel temptation, we wouldn't be good. But according to Hick, this response does fail. Humans could still be tempted to sin, but just be created by God in such a way that they always overcome this temptation. So Hick is not saying, why didn't God make us angels and incapable of sinning? Hick is saying, why didn't God make us saints? Saints being people that do feel temptation, but always have the psychological makeup to overcome them. Why aren't we saints? And if we overcome temptation, we could still be good, even by Ninian Smart's defense here, comments here. So here's how he does it, Hick. He says, if it is logically possible that men should be so constituted that their psychological makeup is very strong, that they always overcome sin, that they always freely choose the good, is it also logically possible that God should make them so? Hick's answer is an undeniable yes. According to Hick, God could have made us in such a way, and we would still technically be free. And there would be a lot less suffering in the world because there's a lot less sin. But he pushes forth and asks a new question. Is it logically possible for God so to make men that always choose to do good and will freely respond to himself, to God, in love and trust and faith? That is, can God make persons without sin who have the right relationship to God? And Hick's answer is no. Hick reminds us, God wants us to have the right relationship with other persons. That's important for God. But more importantly, God wants us to have the right relationship with him. Remember, sin is to have the improper relationship with God. To be without sin is to have the proper relationship with God. It just so happens that the proper relationship with God is one of obedience and following him and loving God and doing good by your neighbor as well. But that's, just so happens to be the case. That just so happens to be the case that that's what it means to have a proper relationship with God. But sin in and of itself, or to be without sin in and of itself, fundamentally at its core, means to have the proper relationship with God. And here he considers the hypnotist and his patient, a really good analogy. He says, look, a patient can, under hypnosis, be given a series of instructions which he is to carry out after waking, say to go to a certain time to a certain library and borrow a certain book, and he may at the same time be told that he will forget he received these instructions. On coming out of the hypnotic trance, he will then be obediently unaware of what transpired in it, but will nevertheless at the prescribed time feel an imperious desire to go to the library and borrow the book, a desire that the ordinary resources of the educated intellect will find no difficulty in rationalizing. The patient will thus carry out the hypnotist's commands while seeming both to himself and to others to be doing so of his own free will and for his own sufficient reasons. So here are some questions. Is the patient free in relation to himself? Yes. There's no external compulsion. The desire to check out the book comes from within him. Is the patient free in relation to his fellow person, the librarian? Yes. The librarian doesn't have any reason to doubt that he is being coerced. The librarian themselves is not coercing them. And the person, the hypnotized, is not coercing the librarian either. But here's the important question. The most important question, according to Hick. Is the patient free in relation to the hypnotist? And the answer is no, according to Hick. In relation to the hypnotist, he is a kind of puppet or a kind of tool. Of course, there's an analogy, right? In this case, the hypnotist is God, the patient is us, and the librarian is a fellow person. The hypnotist, God, made the patient us in a certain way that we would do the right thing and take out the book and act properly with our fellow librarian, our fellow person. And even though we ourselves aren't aware that we were made this way, we were in a sense brainwashed, and we ourselves think we're free, that this comes from within us, the hypnotist knows better. And remember, to sin is to have the wrong relationship with God. Lacking sin is to have the right relationship with God, one of love, trust, and obedience. Suppose the hypnotist asks the patient to trust the hypnotist, to love him, to devotedly serve him. There will be something inauthentic to that. The love from a non-hypnotized patient will be far more valuable. Trust, love, admiration, respect, affection are produced, therefore, by some type of psychological manipulation if the hypnotist were to ask that, which bypasses the conscious responsible center of the personality, of personhood. And if that's the case, if this psychological manipulation occurs, they are not real trust, they are not real love. In other words, this would be the wrong relationship with God. But it is the wrong relationship with God. This is sin. It is logically impossible for God to obtain your love unforced by anything outside you, and yet himself force it, Hick says. Conclusion is that sin exists because without it, we would not be able to enter a proper, authentic relationship with God as persons. So let's go ahead and formalize that, right? So make sure that's all clear and in one place. Step 1. God's omnipotence does not mean he could do that which is logically impossible. Step 2. Creating a person that is free but not able to sin is logically impossible. Again, to sin is to have an improper relationship with God. 3. Nonetheless, God could have created free persons who can choose to act wrongly to themselves and fellow persons. Notice that, right? Act wrongly to themselves and fellow persons. That's not what sin is. Not by definition, not per se, not in and of itself. But always overcome temptation during these moments and choose to act correctly, like saints. So God could have done that. But God could not have created for persons who can choose to sin, that is, have the wrong relationship to God, but always overcome temptation during these moments and choose to act correctly, have the right relationship to God. That is, God cannot create free persons who can have the wrong relationship to God, but always have the right relationship to God. That will be psychological manipulation, resulting in the wrong relationship with God. They would not be free. And that's the most important premise. The conclusion is that sin exists in this world because there was no other choice. So what is the takeaway from this? Well, what do we think of this argument now that I kind of lay it out for you here? Do we agree with all the premises? Does this conclusion necessarily follow from the premises? A big portion depends on defining sin in this very specific way as a relationship. Is this the way you personally define sin? And, a good question at the end of this is that we've only been talking about sin that comes from humans, evil that comes from humans. What about non-man-made sin, such as natural disasters? Do we have a potential defense or explanation for that? What do you think? But with that said, folks, that's all for today. I'll see you folks next time. Bye-bye.